30,000 feet above Texas, a 17-year-old girl asked to use the bathroom. 5 minutes later, the plane was turning around. 10 minutes after that, federal officers were boarding with their hands near their holsters. And by the time the truth came out, a United States senator's career was hanging by a thread, a security agent had lost her job, and the entire country was asking the same question. How does needing to pee become a national incident? Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Have you ever been made to feel like you don't belong somewhere you had every right to be? Have you ever asked for something simple, something human, and been treated like a criminal for it? Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. Because what happened on that flight could happen to anyone. And if you think it couldn't happen to you, you need to hear this story. Here's what they don't tell you about racism in 2025. It doesn't always scream. It doesn't always wear a hood or burn a cross. Sometimes it wears a cream-colored blazer and diamond studs. Sometimes it speaks in calm, measured tones about protocols and security. Sometimes it smiles at you while it calls the pilot and tells him you're a threat. And sometimes, the most dangerous person on the plane isn't the one asking for basic human dignity. It's the one who's been trained to see danger in a hoodie and a skin tone. This is the story of Camryn, a black teenager who made the mistake of having a full bladder on the wrong flight. This is the story of Natalie, a white woman with a badge and a backstory that will make you question everything you thought you knew about how good people become monsters. And this is the story of a moment when a bathroom door became a battle line, and a commercial flight became a courtroom at cruising altitude. But before we get to the part where the plane lands and the cameras start rolling and the internet loses its mind, you need to understand something. Natalie wasn't always like this. She wasn't born checking faces for threats. She wasn't raised to block aisles and call in favors from cockpit crews. There was a time when she would have been the first person to stand up for someone like Camryn. There was a time when her best friend in the entire world looked exactly like the girl she just turned into a suspect. What happened to her? What breaks inside a person that turns protection into persecution? Stay with me because we're going to answer that question. But first, you need to see what she did. You need to feel what Camryn felt when a simple request became a spectacle. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere you had every right to be, hit that subscribe button right now. If you've ever watched someone use authority like a weapon and wondered why nobody stopped them, this channel is for you. We're not just telling stories here. We're exposing the machinery. We're showing you how racism hides in plain sight, wearing expensive perfume and speaking in codes that sound like safety but feel like chains. And if you don't subscribe, you're going to miss the stories that actually matter. The ones that make you uncomfortable. The ones that change how you see the world. Camryn didn't know any of this when she stood up from seat 14C. She didn't know that the woman in 13C had a direct line to a senator. She didn't know that asking to use the forward bathroom would trigger a sequence of events that would land her on the news, in a police report, and in a phone call with a political operative offering hush money disguised as an apology. She didn't know that the two men in row 12 weren't just passengers. She didn't know that her bladder was about to become a federal case. All she knew was that the drink cart was blocking the back aisle, the turbulence was getting worse and she needed to go. That's it. That's the whole crime. Needing to be human in a space where someone else had decided she didn't have permission. So here's the question we're going to answer in the next few minutes. What happens when a black girl's body becomes a threat? What happens when a white woman's fear becomes policy? What happens when a plane full of witnesses has to choose between staying silent and speaking up? And what happens when the person enforcing the rules used to be the kind of person who would have fought against them? Has something like this ever happened in your community? Have you seen someone get treated differently because of how they look? Comment below and tell me your story. Because this isn't just about one plane. This is about every space where power decides who belongs and who doesn't. And here's what's going to shock you. By the end of this story, you're going to understand something most people spend their whole lives avoiding. That cruelty isn't always born from hate. Sometimes it's born from love that got twisted into something unrecognizable. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who were hurt first. If you're still watching, you're already one of the real ones. Drop a like on this video right now because what comes next is going to make you angry, it's going to break your heart, and it's going to change the way you see every polite smile and every calm voice that tells you to wait your turn. Let's go back to Atlanta. January. The day Camryn's life changed because she had to pee. Camryn Washington was not supposed to be on that plane alone. The original plan had her traveling with Mrs. Chin, her documentary program advisor, but Mrs. Chin's father had a stroke 2 days before the trip. So Camryn went solo. 17 years old, 5'4", with box braids, she'd spent 6 hours getting done the weekend before because she wanted to look professional for the interview. She had a backpack full of equipment she'd borrowed from the school's media lab, a notebook with questions she'd rehearsed 40 times, and a dream that felt too big for her chest. Let me ask you something. Do you know a young person like Camryn? Someone who's working twice as hard for half the recognition? Someone who's carrying dreams that the world keeps trying to crush? If you do, comment their name below. Let's celebrate them. Because people like Camryn are the ones who change the world and they deserve to be seen. She wanted to be a documentary filmmaker. Not the kind that wins awards and forgets where they came from. The kind that goes into communities that get ignored and tells stories that make people uncomfortable enough to change. Her grandmother had raised her on PBS documentaries and old footage of the civil rights movement. Her grandmother, Dorothy, who'd marched in Savannah in 1985 and had the photos to prove it. Dorothy, who made black-eyed peas every Martin Luther King Jr. Day and said the same thing every year. We eat these because they look like coins. We remember that freedom costs something. And we pay it forward. Dorothy had died 8 months before this flight. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and cruel. Camryn still had her number saved in her phone. Sometimes she'd scroll to it just to see the name. Sometimes she'd start typing a text before she remembered there was nobody on the other end to read it. If you've lost someone who believed in you more than you believed in yourself, you know what Camryn was carrying. That weight. That responsibility. That voice in your head that says, make them proud. If you're carrying that weight right now, I see you. Drop a heart emoji in the comments. Let's honor the people who made us who we are. This trip to Phoenix was supposed to be the first big step. Camryn had applied for a youth documentary grant, and part of the requirement was conducting an interview with a community leader addressing social justice issues. She'd connected with a woman named Lucia Montoya, who ran a community center on a reservation an hour north of Phoenix. Lucia had agreed to talk about land rights, about families being displaced by development, about elders losing their homes to investors who saw dirt and saw dollars. It was exactly the kind of story Camryn wanted to tell. The kind her grandmother would have been proud of. So when she boarded that Delta flight in Atlanta, she wasn't just a teenager going to Arizona. She was carrying something bigger. She was carrying her grandmother's voice. She was carrying every lesson about dignity and resistance and refusing to shrink. She texted her mom a selfie under the gate sign, her smile nervous but real, and her mom texted back 3 heart emojis and the words, "Grandma Dorothy is with you, baby. Make us proud." Camryn had a window seat 14C and she liked that. She liked watching the ground fall away, like the way clouds looked solid from above, like the strange peace of being unreachable for a few hours. The man next to her in 14B was middle-aged, wore a Chicago Cubs hat, and fell asleep before takeoff. He seemed harmless. The woman in front of her in 13C had blonde hair that looked expensive and a posture that looked practiced. Camryn didn't think much of her. Why would she? She spent the first hour of the flight reviewing her questions, making notes in the margins, trying not to think about how much was riding on this. If the interview went well, if the footage was good, if she could edit it into something coherent, she'd have a real shot at the grant. $1,000. Enough to buy her own camera. Enough to stop borrowing equipment and start building a portfolio. Enough to prove to her mom, who worked 2 jobs and still made time to drive her to film workshops, that the investment was worth it. Here's what I need you to understand. Camryn was good at school. Straight A's, honor roll, the kind of kid teachers wrote recommendation letters for without being asked. But she wasn't interested in being good. She was interested in being necessary. She wanted to make work that mattered. She wanted to walk into rooms where decisions were being made and say, "You're forgetting someone. Let me show you who." How many of you are trying to do the same thing? How many of you are working on something that matters, something that's bigger than you? Comment, "I'm building something," if that's you. Because you need to hear this story. You need to see what happens when the world tries to stop you and you refuse to be stopped. Her grandmother used to say, "Baby, the world doesn't need more people who are smart. It needs more people who are brave enough to care out loud." Camryn had written that in the front of her notebook. She looked at it every time she doubted herself. Every time she wondered if she was too young, too inexperienced, too idealistic. She looked at it and heard Dorothy's voice and she kept going. She didn't drink much water on flights. She hated airplane bathrooms, hated the cramped space and the weird blue lighting and the way the lock never felt secure. But somewhere over Texas, the turbulence started, and her stomach got uneasy, and she'd finished a whole bottle of water without thinking about it. The seatbelt sign kept dinging on and off. The flight attendants were moving the drink cart up the aisle, and it was blocking the path to the rear bathroom. She waited. She tried to distract herself with her notes. But eventually biology won. She unbuckled her seatbelt. The woman in 13C turned her head slightly, like she'd been waiting for Camryn to move. Camryn said, "Excuse me, I need to get past." Polite. Clear. The way her mother had taught her to speak in public spaces where being misunderstood could cost you something. The woman didn't move. She said, "The forward lavatory is reserved." Camryn blinked. Reserved? She'd flown before. Not often, but enough to know that wasn't a thing. Bathrooms on planes weren't reserved unless you were in a different cabin, and even then it was more suggestion than rule. She said, "It's urgent. The card is blocking the back." The woman's eyes did something Camryn had seen before but could never quite name. It was a look that measured and dismissed in the same glance. A look that decided you weren't worth the explanation. The woman said louder this time, "It's reserved. Please return to your seat." A few people turned. The man in 14B woke up. Camryn felt heat rise in her face, not from anger yet, but from the sudden awareness that she was being made into a scene. She was wearing her Howard University hoodie, the one she'd bought at a summer program she'd worked all year to afford. She wondered if that was part of the equation. She hated that she had to wonder. Have you ever had to wonder if your clothes, your hair, your skin was the reason someone treated you differently? Have you ever had to calculate whether speaking up would make things better or worse? That's the tax people like Camryn pay every single day. If you've paid that tax, comment, "I know this feeling." Let's build a community of people who understand. She tried to step into the aisle anyway. That's when the woman stood. Tall, elegant, immovable. That's when Camryn realized this wasn't about a bathroom. This was about something else. Something older. Something her grandmother had warned her about in 100 different ways. This was about who gets to move freely. And who has to ask permission. If you're still with me, hit that like button right now. Because what happens next is going to make your blood boil. Her name was Natalie Brennan, though Camryn wouldn't learn that until later. All Camryn saw in that moment was a wall in human form. Natalie was maybe 40, maybe older, with the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now something sharper. Her blonde hair was cut in a precise bob that didn't move when she did. She wore a cream blazer that fit like it had been tailored, a silk scarf folded in her lap with a logo Camryn didn't recognize, and a watch that caught the overhead light in a way that said money without saying anything at all. But it was her eyes that Camryn would remember later. Pale blue, almost gray, and completely empty of doubt. They were the eyes of someone who had made a decision about you before you opened your mouth. The eyes of someone who had been trained to assess threats and had decided you were one. Let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone like this? Someone who looked at you and decided in 3 seconds that you were the problem? Someone whose power was so casual they didn't even have to raise their voice? Comment, "I've met this person," if you know exactly who I'm talking about. Because people like Natalie are everywhere. And they're dangerous precisely because they don't think they're being cruel. They think they're doing their job. Natalie didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She had the kind of authority that came from years of being listened to, years of having her word be the final one. She stood in the aisle with her body angled just enough to block Camryn's path and she said, "There is a protocol for security. You can wait." Camryn felt her pulse in her throat. She said, "I just need to use the bathroom. I'm not trying to cause a problem." Natalie's mouth did something that might have been a smile on someone else. On her it looked like a warning. "Then don't," she said. The flight attendant arrived. Her name tag said Ariel. She was short, with dark hair pulled back tight, and she had the kind of face that had learned to stay calm in turbulence. She looked at Natalie, then at Camryn, and Camryn saw her do the math. She saw Ariel's eyes flicker to the hoodie, to the blonde woman's blazer, to the space between them that had become a border. Ariel said, "Ma'am, the forward lavatory is available for any passenger if the rear is blocked. Is there a problem?" Natalie turned to her with the patience of someone explaining something to a child. "The forward lavatory is reserved during this flight. We've made that clear." Ariel's professional smile tightened. "Ma'am, I'm the senior attendant on this flight, and I haven't reserved any lavatory. If there's a specific concern." Natalie reached up and touched her earlobe. It was a small motion, barely noticeable, but Camryn saw it. It looked like she was adjusting an earring, except there was something deliberate about it. Something rehearsed. And that's when Camryn noticed the 2 men in row 12. They had been so still she hadn't registered them as anything other than passengers. But now they were standing. Not quickly. Not aggressively. Just standing in perfect sync, like they'd been waiting for a cue. They were both in their 30s, both wearing fleece jackets and baseball caps, both with the kind of build that came from discipline rather than vanity. Their faces were blank. Their hands were loose at their sides. But their eyes were locked on Camryn. If you're watching this and your heart just started beating faster, That's because you understand what Camryn was feeling. That moment when you realize you're outnumbered. When you realize the rules just changed and nobody told you. Share this video right now with someone who needs to see it. Because this is what power looks like when it doesn't have to justify itself. Ariel saw them too. Her smile disappeared. Gentlemen, please sit down. We're experiencing turbulence. Neither of them sat. One of them said, we're fine standing. Natalie said, these are my colleagues. We're traveling together. And we're asking this passenger to use the rear lavatory. Ariel's voice got quieter, which somehow made it sharper. Ma'am, I don't know what you've been told, but you don't have the authority to restrict bathroom access on a commercial flight. If you're concerned about something specific, you need to tell me what it is. Natalie's eyes went cold. I don't need to tell you anything. I need you to do your job and maintain order. Camryn felt the cabin shift. Not the plane. The people. Heads were turning now. Phones were coming out. A teenage boy across the aisle had his camera pointed at them, his hand shaking slightly, his thumb hovering over the record button. An older man in 15A said, what's going on? Why can't she use the bathroom? Here's the core issue we need to talk about. This isn't just about one woman on one plane. This is about a system that gives certain people the power to decide who belongs and who doesn't. This is about the way authority gets weaponized against people who look a certain way. This is about the fact that Camryn could do everything right and still be treated like a threat. If this makes you angry, comment, this has to stop. Because your voice matters. Your engagement pushes this story to more people who need to hear it. Natalie didn't answer him. She kept her eyes on Ariel and she said, if this passenger refuses to comply, we'll need to involve the flight deck. Camryn's stomach dropped. Involve the flight deck. That meant the pilots. That meant something official. That meant she was about to become a problem that got written down. She said, I'm not refusing anything. I just need to pee. Her voice cracked on the last word and she hated herself for it. She hated that this woman could make her feel small. She hated that she had to justify her own body. She hated that the man in 14B was now fully awake and watching her with a mix of pity and discomfort, like he wanted to help but didn't know how. Natalie reached past Ariel and pressed the call button for the cockpit. She did it smoothly, like she'd done it before, like she had every right. She leaned toward the intercom panel and said, in a voice that was suddenly crisp and professional, Captain, this is Brennan. We have a situation in economy. Requesting protocol Delta 7. The cabin went quiet. Even the turbulence seemed to pause. Camryn didn't know what Delta 7 meant, but she knew what situation meant. She knew what economy meant when it was said like that, with just enough emphasis to make it sound like a location and a judgment at the same time. Ariel's face went pale. She said, Ma'am, that is not appropriate. There is no situation. This is a passenger requesting. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice came through, tight and clipped. Copy that. Initiating protocol. All passengers, return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We're diverting to Dallas. The plane banked left. Camryn felt it in her stomach, in her knees, in the sudden understanding that she had just become the reason 150 people were about to miss their connections. Natalie looked at her. And this time she smiled for real. If you made it this far, you're one of the real ones. Comment, I'm still here, so I know you're with me. Because what comes next is going to blow your mind. The sound that went through the cabin wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a groan. It was something in between, the noise people make when they realize their day just got complicated and they don't know why. A baby started crying in the back. Someone said, Are you kidding me? A woman with a laptop open in row 18 closed it hard enough that the snap carried. Camryn stood frozen in the aisle. Her legs felt like they'd forgotten how to hold her. The plane was turning. She could feel it in the way her body wanted to lean right even though they were banking left. She could feel it in the hum of the engines changing pitch. She could feel it in the way Ariel's hand went to the seat back to steady herself, her knuckles white, her jaw tight. Let me ask you something real quick. Have you ever been blamed for something that wasn't your fault? Have you ever been in a room where everyone was looking at you like you were the problem, when all you did was exist? That's what Camryn was feeling right now. And if you felt that, you need to subscribe to this channel. Because we tell the stories that nobody else wants to tell. We expose the moments that get swept under the rug. And if you don't subscribe, you're going to miss the truth that could change your life. The man in 14B stood up. He was taller than Camryn had expected, with a face that looked tired in a permanent kind of way, like he'd seen too many versions of this story. He pulled a wallet from his jacket pocket and held up an ID card. He said, I'm a public defender with Cook County. Ma'am, if you're detaining this passenger, You need to identify yourself and state your legal authority. Natalie didn't even look at him. She said, "Sit down, sir." The public defender didn't sit. He said, "You just diverted a commercial flight. That's a federal issue. If you don't have cause, you're opening yourself and whoever you're working for to a lawsuit that's going to cost more than this plane." One of the men from row 12 took a step closer. Not into the public defender's space, but close enough to make the threat clear. He said, "Sir, for your safety and the safety of others, sit down." The teenager with the phone hit record. Camryn heard the faint beep, saw the red dot appear on the screen. The boy said, "I'm filming this. Just so everyone knows. This is the moment. This is when ordinary people have to decide whether they're going to be witnesses or bystanders." That teenager made a choice. He pulled out his phone. He documented what was happening. He refused to let this moment disappear. What would you have done? Would you have filmed? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have looked down and hoped it ended quickly? Comment your honest answer. No judgment. Just truth. Natalie's head turned 1 degree. She said, "Put the phone away." The boy didn't. He said, "It's a public space. I can film." The second man from row 12 moved down the aisle toward him. He didn't touch the phone. He didn't touch the boy. He just stood there, close enough that the boy had to tilt his head back to look at him, and he said, "Son, you don't want to do this." The boy's hand shook, but he kept recording. Ariel stepped between them. She was a foot shorter than the man, but she put her body in the gap anyway, and she said, "Sir, step back. You are not law enforcement. You do not give orders on this aircraft." The man looked at Natalie. Natalie gave the smallest nod. The man stepped back. But he didn't sit down. The public defender said, "Who are you people?" Natalie finally turned to face him. She said, "We are private security contracted to protect a high-value client. That's all you need to know. High-value client." The words hung in the air like a confession. Camryn's brain caught up a second later. Security. Not random passengers. Not air marshals. Private security. Which meant someone on this plane was important enough to have bodyguards. Important enough to make a pilot turn a plane around. Important enough that a 17-year-old girl asking to pee could be treated like a threat. Here's what you need to understand. This is how power works in America. It's not always loud. It's not always obvious. Sometimes it's 3 people in fleece jackets who can ground a plane with a phone call. Sometimes it's a woman in a blazer who can turn your body into a security threat. Sometimes it's a system that protects the comfort of the powerful at the expense of everyone else's dignity. If this makes you angry, smash that like button. If this makes you want to do something, share this video. Because anger without action is just noise. The public defender said, "Who's the client?" Natalie said, "That's not your concern." A woman in row 10 said, "Is it the senator? I saw her in Atlanta at the fundraiser last night." Natalie's face didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. It was the look of someone whose cover just got blown in the most inconvenient way possible. She said, "Ma'am, please stay seated." The woman in row 10 didn't stay seated. She stood up, pulling her phone out. She said, "It is her. Senator Lane. She's sitting up front. I saw her when I boarded." The cabin erupted. Not in chaos, but in that low buzz of people putting pieces together and not liking the picture. Someone said, "So we're being diverted because a senator doesn't want a kid using the bathroom?" Someone else said, "That's insane." A man in row 20 said, "I'm missing my daughter's recital for this?" Ariel picked up the intercom. She said, "Captain, this is Ariel. We do not have a security threat. We have a dispute over lavatory access. I am requesting we continue to Phoenix." The intercom crackled. The captain's voice came back, and this time it sounded defensive. "Decision's been made, Ariel. We're landing in Dallas. Protocol was invoked. My hands are tied." Ariel closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were aimed at Natalie like weapons. She said, "What protocol? What specific threat did you report?" Natalie said, "That's classified." The public defender laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. He said, "Classified. On a domestic commercial flight. Do you hear yourself?" Natalie's voice dropped. It got quieter, which made it worse. She said, "Sir, if you continue to interfere, you will be removed from this flight and charged with disrupting a federal operation." The public defender said, "What federal operation?" "Your private security. You have no federal authority." Natalie said, "Our client does." And there it was. The thing everyone had been dancing around. The reason the plane was turning. The reason Camryn was still standing in the aisle with her bladder screaming and her heart pounding. The reason 150 people were about to land in the wrong city. Because someone with power had decided that power meant rewriting the rules. Because someone with a badge and a paycheck had decided a black teenager in a hoodie was dangerous enough to justify all of this. If you're watching this and you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? This is the content that matters. This is the truth that changes minds. Hit that subscribe button right now because we're just getting started. And if you scroll past this without subscribing, you're part of the problem. You're choosing comfort over truth. Don't be that person. Camryn found her voice. It came out smaller than she wanted, but it came out. She said, "I didn't do anything wrong." Natalie looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since this started. And what Camryn saw in her face wasn't anger. It wasn't even cruelty. It was something colder. It was certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't need evidence because it's already made up its mind. Natalie said, "You tried to access a restricted area. You refused to comply with instructions. You created a disturbance." Camryn said, "I asked to use the bathroom." Natalie said, "You made a choice. Now you deal with the consequences." The boy with the phone said, "This is crazy. She didn't do anything." The public defender said, "I'm a witness. I'll testify to that." The woman in row 10 said, "Me too." A man in row 16 said, "Same." Ariel said, "I'm documenting all of this. Every word. If you're a witness to this story right now, prove it. Comment, 'I'm a witness' below. Let's build a record. Let's show that people are paying attention. Because that's how change happens. Not when one person speaks up. When thousands do." Natalie didn't flinch. She said, "Document whatever you want. We followed protocol. We protected our principal. That's our job." The plane shuddered through another patch of rough air. The seatbelt sign dinged again, insistent now, like it was tired of being ignored. The captain's voice came back over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be on the ground in Dallas in approximately 12 minutes. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Law enforcement will be boarding to address the situation." Law enforcement. Camryn's hands started shaking. She'd never been in trouble. Never been suspended, never been arrested, never even gotten a detention. She was the kid who turned in extra credit. The kid who helped teachers carry boxes. The kid who said "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," because her mother had taught her that manners were armor. And now she was the situation. Ariel put a hand on her shoulder. "Gentle. Steady." She said, "Camryn, sit down. When we land, I'm walking off with you. You're not alone in this." Camryn nodded. She didn't trust her voice. She slid back into her seat, and the man in 14B moved his legs to give her room, and he said quietly, "This is wrong. Everyone here knows it's wrong." Camryn buckled her seatbelt. Her hands were still shaking. She looked out the window and saw the ground getting closer, the flat brown expanse of Texas spreading out like a judgment. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about the interview she was going to miss. She thought about her mom, who was probably tracking the flight right now and seeing the diversion and panicking. She pulled out her phone. She typed, "Mom, I'm okay. Plane diverted. Long story. I'll call when we land." She didn't send it. Not yet. Because she didn't know if she was okay. She didn't know what was waiting for her on the ground. She didn't know if this was the kind of story that ended with an apology or the kind that ended with her name in a police report. She looked up at Natalie, who had finally sat back down in 13C, her posture perfect, her face calm, like she'd just completed a task and was satisfied with the result. Camryn wondered what it felt like to have that much power. To be that sure. To look at another human being and see a problem that needed solving instead of a person who just needed to pee. The wheels touched down in Dallas. The reverse thrusters roared. The plane slowed. And Camryn's life split into before and after. Comment before and after, if you've ever had a moment like this. A moment that changed everything. Because we all have them. And we need to talk about them. The plane stopped moving, but nobody moved. It was like the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting to see what happened next. Camryn could hear the engines winding down, could hear the muffled voices of the flight crew up front, could hear her own heartbeat in her ears like a drum she couldn't turn off. The captain's voice came over the intercom one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Law enforcement will be boarding momentarily to address a security matter. We apologize for the inconvenience and appreciate your patience." Security matter. That's what she was now. Not a person. Not a student. Not a girl with a dream and a dead grandmother's voice in her head. A security matter. The forward door opened. 3 men in dark uniforms stepped onto the plane. Dallas police. Airport security. One of them had his hand resting on his belt near his radio, not threatening but ready. They moved down the aisle with the kind of calm that came from doing this 100 times before. The lead officer was older, maybe 50, with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen enough to be tired but not enough to be cruel. He stopped at row 13. He looked at Natalie. He said, "Ma'am, you called in the security alert?" Natalie stood. She pulled a badge from inside her blazer and held it up. She said, "Natalie Brennan, Sentinel Security Group. We're contracted to Senator Patricia Lane. We had a passenger attempt to breach a restricted area and refuse compliance with security instructions." The officer looked at the badge. He looked at Natalie. He looked past her at Camryn, who was still buckled into 14C with her hands folded in her lap because she didn't know what else to do with them. He said, "Which passenger?" Natalie pointed. "Seat 14C. Every head in the cabin turned. Camryn felt the weight of it, the eyes, the judgment, the curiosity. She felt like an exhibit. Like something behind glass that people could look at but not touch. "Here's the question I need you to answer right now. If you were on that plane, would you have said something? Would you have stood up and told the officer what really happened? Or would you have stayed quiet and hoped someone else did it? Be honest. Comment your answer. Because this is the moment that separates witnesses from bystanders. And we need more witnesses." The officer walked to Camryn's row. He said, "Miss, I'm Officer Daniels. Can you step into the aisle for me, please?" Camryn unbuckled. Her legs felt like water. She stood. She said, "I didn't do anything wrong." Officer Daniels said, "Nobody's saying you did. I just need to hear your side." The public defender in 14B stood up again. He said, "Officer, I'm an attorney and I witnessed the entire incident. This young woman asked to use the lavatory. She was blocked by private security without cause. There was no breach, no threat, no refusal to comply. This is a false report." Officer Daniels looked at him. "And you are?" The public defender handed him a card. "Marcus Webb, Cook County Public Defender's Office. I'm happy to provide a statement." Ariel stepped forward. She said, "Officer, I'm the senior flight attendant. I can confirm Mr. Webb's account. This passenger made a reasonable request. She was denied access without justification. The security alert was initiated by Ms. Brennan without consulting the flight crew or providing any specific threat assessment." Officer Daniels looked at Natalie. "Ma'am, what was the specific threat?" Natalie's face didn't change. She said, "The passenger exhibited suspicious behavior. She attempted to access a restricted area. When instructed to stop, she became argumentative." Camryn's voice came out louder than she expected. "That's a lie." Natalie's eyes cut to her. Sure. "Excuse me?" Camryn felt something crack open inside her. Maybe it was fear turning into anger. Maybe it was her grandmother's voice finally breaking through. Maybe it was just the fact that she'd been holding her pee for 45 minutes and had been called a liar by a woman who didn't even know her name. She said, "I asked to use the bathroom. You said it was reserved. I said it was urgent. You blocked me. You called your guys. You made this happen. And now you're lying about it. If you've ever had to stand up to someone who had more power than you know how hard this was. You know the fear. You know the risk. If you've ever been that brave, comment, I stood up. Because Camryn just did something most adults can't do. She told the truth when it was dangerous." The teenager with the phone said, "I got it on video. All of it." Officer Daniels turned. "You recorded this?" The boy nodded. His hand was still shaking but he held the phone out. "From when she asked to use the bathroom until the plane turned around. It's all here." Officer Daniels took the phone. He watched. His face didn't move but something behind his eyes did. He watched for 2 minutes. Then he handed the phone back. He said, "Thank you, son." He turned to Natalie. "Ma'am, I don't see any suspicious behavior on that video. I see a passenger making a polite request and being denied. I see you escalating the situation. I see you calling the cockpit. What I don't see is a threat." Natalie said, "We're trained to identify threats that aren't obvious. We assess behavior, body language, context. This passenger fit a profile." The cabin went silent. Not the kind of silence that's empty. The kind that's full of things people want to say but don't know if they should. The kind that's one word away from exploding. Marcus Webb said, "What profile?" Natalie said, "I'm not at liberty to discuss our security protocols." Marcus said, "Let me guess. Young. Black. Hoodie. That's the profile, isn't it?" Natalie's jaw tightened. "That's not what I said." Marcus said, "But it's what you meant. This is the core issue. This is what we need to engage with. Racial profiling doesn't always announce itself. It hides behind words like protocol and profile and security. It dresses up in professional language and expensive clothes. But it's still the same ugly thing. If you understand this, if you've experienced this, comments say their names, so we remember every person who's been profiled, stopped, questioned, or worse, just for existing. Your comment matters. Your voice pushes this message further. Officer Daniels said, "Ms. Brennan, I'm going to need you to come with me. We need to file a report on this incident, and I have some questions about your security protocols and whether they comply with federal aviation regulations." Natalie's face finally changed. Just a flicker. Just enough to show that she hadn't expected this. She said, "I was doing my job." Officer Daniels said, "Maybe. But your job doesn't override federal law. And filing a false security report is a crime." One of the men from row 12 stepped forward. "Officer, we can verify Ms. Brennan's account. We were present for the entire incident." Officer Daniels looked at him. "And you are?" The man hesitated. Just for a second. Just long enough for Officer Daniels to notice. He said, "We're part of the security detail." Officer Daniels said, "Names and IDs, please." The two men exchanged a glance. The kind of glance that said they were calculating something. The kind that said they were deciding how much trouble this was worth. One of them pulled out a wallet. The other did the same. They handed over IDs. Officer Daniels looked at them. He said, "You're both former Secret Service." The first man said, "Yes, sir." Officer Daniels said, "Then you know better than this. You know you can't just ground a commercial flight because someone made you nervous. You know the standards. You know the law." The second man said, "We were following Ms. Brennan's lead. She's our team leader." Officer Daniels looked at Natalie. "So this was your call?" Natalie said, "Yes." Officer Daniels said, "Based on what evidence?" Natalie said, "Based on my training and experience." Officer Daniels said, "Your training told you a teenage girl asking to use the bathroom was a threat serious enough to divert a plane and involve federal resources?" Natalie didn't answer. For the first time since this whole thing started, she didn't have words. She just stood there, her blazer perfect, her posture perfect, her face finally showing the cracks. The woman from row 10 stood up. She said, "Officer, I want to make a statement too. I saw the whole thing. That girl didn't do anything wrong. And I know who they're protecting. Senator Lane is sitting in first class. I saw her. This is about her, not about security." Officer Daniels said, "Ma'am, I appreciate that, but..." The woman said, "No, you need to hear this. Senator Lane has been all over the news for her stance on immigration, on policing, on who belongs in this country and who doesn't. And now her security team is treating a black teenager like a criminal for needing to pee? That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. This is making you angry. Good. Use that anger. Share this video right now. Send it to someone who needs to understand how power protects itself. Send it to someone who thinks racism is over. Send it to someone who says, just comply and nothing bad will happen. Because Camryn complied. And look what happened." A voice came from the front of the plane. "Excuse me. Let me through." Everyone turned. A woman was walking down the aisle from first class. She was in her 60s, with silver hair cut short and sharp, wearing a navy suit that looked like it cost more than Camryn's entire wardrobe. Her face was the kind that looked good on camera, the kind that had been trained to smile on command and mean it just enough to be convincing. Senator Patricia Lane. She stopped next to Officer Daniels. She said, "Officer, I'm Senator Patricia Lane. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." Officer Daniels said, "Senator." Senator Lane looked at Natalie. Something passed between them. Not words. Just a look. The kind of look that said, "We'll talk about this later." Then she turned to Camryn. She smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced. Warm. Completely empty. She said, "Sweetheart, I am so sorry. My security team can be a bit overzealous sometimes. They're just trying to keep me safe, you understand. But this should never have happened. You have my sincerest apologies." Camryn stared at her. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she was supposed to say thank you or if that would make her complicit in whatever this was. She didn't know if this was an apology or a performance. Senator Lane said, "Officer, I think we can resolve this without any formal reports. I'll personally ensure that my security team receives additional training. And I'd like to offer this young woman compensation for her trouble. Let's say $10,000 for the inconvenience." The cabin erupted. Not in agreement. In shock. in the sudden understanding that they were watching someone try to buy their way out of accountability in real time. Marcus Webb said, "Senator, with all due respect, you can't just write a check and make this go away." Senator Lane's smile didn't move. "I'm not trying to make anything go away, Mr. Webb." Marcus Webb. Senator Lane said, "Mr. Webb, I'm trying to make things right. This young woman has been through an ordeal. I want to help." Camryn found her voice. It came from somewhere deep, somewhere that sounded like her grandmother. She said, "I don't want your money." Senator Lane blinked. "I'm sorry?" Camryn said, "I don't want your money. I want an explanation. I want to know why your security guard looked at me and saw a threat. I want to know what profile I fit. I want to know why I can't use a bathroom on a plane I paid to be on without being treated like a criminal. How many of you are cheering for Camryn right now? How many of you wish you could have been there to stand next to her? Comment, stand with Camryn, if you're on her side. Because this is what courage looks like. This is what refusing to be bought looks like. And we need to celebrate it." Senator Lane's smile finally cracked. She said, "Young lady, I understand you're upset." Camryn said, "I'm not upset. I'm angry. There's a difference." Senator Lane looked at Officer Daniels. "Officer, can we please handle this off the aircraft? These passengers have been delayed long enough." Officer Daniels said, "Senator, I still need to file a report. A security alert was issued. Federal protocol requires documentation." Senator Lane said, "Of course. But perhaps we can expedite things. I have a meeting in Phoenix that I really can't miss." Ariel said, "With all due respect, Senator, we all had places to be." Senator Lane's face went cold. Just for a second. Just long enough for everyone to see the person behind the smile. Then the smile came back and she said, "Of course. You're absolutely right." She turned to Camryn. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Camryn said, "Camryn Washington." Senator Lane said, "Camryn? That's a beautiful name. Camryn, I promise you this will be investigated. My office will be in touch. We'll make sure this never happens again." Camryn said, "To me? Or to anyone?" Senator Lane paused. "I'm sorry?" Camryn said, "Are you going to make sure this never happens to me again? Or are you going to make sure your security team stops treating people like me as threats?" The cabin held its breath. This was the question. The one that mattered. The one that separated a personal apology from actual change. Senator Lane said, "Both? I promise you both?" Camryn looked at her. Really looked at her. And she saw what her grandmother had taught her to see. She saw the performance. She saw the calculation. She saw someone who was very good at saying the right thing and very practiced at not meaning it. Camryn said, "I'm going to hold you to that." Senator Lane's smile tightened. "I hope you do. If you made it this far, you're not just watching. You're bearing witness." Comment, "I'm bearing witness, so I know you're still here. Because what comes next is going to break your heart and put it back together in a way you didn't expect." They didn't arrest anyone. Officer Daniels took statements from Camryn, Marcus, Ariel, the teenager with the video, and half a dozen other passengers who volunteered to be witnesses. He took Natalie aside and spoke to her in low tones that Camryn couldn't hear but could feel. Whatever he said made Natalie's face go pale and tight. Senator Lane disappeared back into first class. Her security team stayed in the aisle, silent and still, like statues that had forgotten how to be human. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of sitting in a grounded plane in Dallas while people filed reports and made phone calls and tried to figure out how a bathroom request had turned into a federal incident. 2 hours of passengers getting angrier, of babies crying, of people missing connections and calling loved ones and demanding answers that nobody seemed to have. Camryn sat in 14C and tried not to cry. She texted her mom. She texted Lucia in Phoenix and explained why she wasn't going to make the interview. She stared out the window at the tarmac and wondered if this was what her grandmother had meant when she said freedom costs something. Finally, they were allowed to deplane. Camryn walked off with Ariel on one side and Marcus on the other, like bodyguards, like proof that she wasn't alone. The terminal was bright and loud and full of people who had no idea what had just happened 30,000 feet above them. Officer Daniels stopped her before she got to the gate. He said, "Miss Washington, here's my card. If you want to file a formal complaint, call me. If you need anything, call me. What happened to you today was wrong. I want you to know that." Camryn took the card. She said, "Thank you." He said, "And for what it's worth? You handled that better than most adults I know." She didn't feel like she'd handled anything. She felt like she'd survived something. There was a difference. Marcus gave her his card too. He said, If Senator Lane's office contacts you, don't sign anything without a lawyer. If you need representation, call me. I'll help you find someone good. Camryn said, "Why are you helping me?" Marcus said, "Because I've seen this story too many times. And I'm tired of watching it end the same way. Have you ever had a stranger show up for you when you needed it most? Have you ever been that stranger for someone else?" Comment, be the stranger, if you believe we need more people like Marcus and Ariel in the world. Because kindness in the face of injustice is a revolutionary act. Ariel hugged her. It was quick and tight and smelled like coffee and lavender. She said, "You're going to be okay. You're stronger than you know." Camryn didn't feel strong. She felt exhausted. But she nodded anyway. She was walking toward the rebooking desk when she heard a voice behind her. "Camryn. Wait." She turned. Natalie was standing there, alone. Her 2 security guys were gone. Her blazer looked rumpled now, like she'd been sitting in it too long. Her face looked different. Older. Tired. Human. Camryn's first instinct was to walk away. Her second instinct was to run. But something in Natalie's face made her stay. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the part of her that wanted to understand how someone could look at her and see a threat. Natalie said, "Can I talk to you? Just for a minute." Camryn said, "Why?" Natalie said, "Because I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth." They sat in a corner of the terminal near a window that looked out at the plains. Natalie bought 2 bottles of water from a vending machine and handed one to Camryn. Camryn didn't drink it. She just held it, cold and solid, something to anchor her hands. Natalie said, "I had a best friend when I was 16. Her name was Kira." Camryn didn't say anything. She just waited. Natalie said, "Kira was black. I was white. We grew up in the same neighborhood in Baltimore, went to the same school, did everything together. She was the funniest person I ever met. She could make me laugh so hard I'd forget whatever I was upset about. She wanted to be a doctor. Pediatrics. She was so good with kids." Natalie's voice cracked. Just a little. Just enough to show that this wasn't a script. This was something real. She said, "We were walking home from a party one night. We were 16. It was late. A cop pulled up and asked what we were doing. Kira said we were just walking home. He said we fit the description of someone who'd robbed a store 2 blocks away. We didn't. We'd been at a party. We had witnesses. But he didn't care." Camryn felt something shift in her chest. She didn't want to feel sympathy for this woman. She didn't want to understand her. But she couldn't stop listening. Natalie said, "He told us to put our hands on the car." Kira asked why. She didn't do it in a mean way. She just asked. And he grabbed her. Slammed her against the hood. She hit her head. She went down. I screamed. He told me to shut up. He cuffed her. She was unconscious. I kept screaming. He called for backup. By the time the ambulance came, she'd been on the ground for 8 minutes. Natalie stopped. She looked out the window. Her hands were shaking. She said, "She died 3 days later. Brain bleed. She was 16 years old. She was going to be a doctor." Camryn's throat felt tight. She said, "I'm sorry." Natalie said, "I spent 20 years trying to make sense of it. 20 years trying to figure out how to stop it from happening again. I went into security. I thought if I could protect people, if I could see threats before they became violence, I could save someone. I could save Kira, even though she was already gone." She turned to look at Camryn. Her eyes were wet. She said, "But somewhere along the way I stopped seeing people. I started seeing threats. I started seeing profiles. I started seeing danger in hoodies and skin tones and teenagers who reminded me of the girl I couldn't save. And today I looked at you and I didn't see Camryn. I saw every worst-case scenario I've been trained to prevent. I saw Kira. And I tried to control it before it could hurt someone." This is the twist. This is the part that makes you question everything. Because Natalie isn't a cartoon villain. She's a person who loved a black girl and lost her and let that grief turn into something toxic. Does that excuse what she did? No. Does it explain it? Maybe. Comment, hurt people hurt people. If you understand that trauma doesn't justify harm, but it does help us understand how harm happens. Camryn said, "You didn't see Kira. You saw a threat. There's a difference." Natalie said, "I know." Camryn said, "Kira wouldn't have wanted this. She wouldn't have wanted you to treat people like me the way that cop treated her." Natalie's face crumpled. She said, "I know." Camryn said, "So why did you do it?" Natalie said, "Because I'm scared. Every day. Every flight. Every face I don't recognize. I'm scared I'm going to miss something. I'm scared someone's going to get hurt on my watch. I'm scared I'm going to lose someone again. Camryn said, so you decided to make me scared instead. Natalie didn't have an answer for that. She just sat there holding her water bottle, looking like someone who just realized she'd become the thing she hated. Camryn said, I have a grandmother who died 8 months ago. She raised me. She taught me how to be brave. She taught me that fear is real, but it's not an excuse. You don't get to make your fear my problem. Natalie said, you're right. Camryn said, I know I am. She stood up. She looked down at Natalie and she felt something she didn't expect. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of understanding. Maybe the recognition that people are complicated. That villains have origin stories. That hurt people, and the cycle doesn't stop until someone chooses to break it. She said, I hope you get help. I hope you figure out how to stop seeing threats and start seeing people again. But that's not my job. My job is to keep walking. Natalie looked up at her. She said, where are you going? Camryn said, Phoenix. I have an interview to reschedule. She walked away. She didn't look back. And for the first time since this whole thing started, she felt like herself again. If you've ever walked away from someone who hurt you, even when part of you wanted to stay and fix them, you know how hard that was. Comment, keep walking, if you believe Camryn did the right thing. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to carry someone else's pain. The story didn't end in Dallas. It exploded. The teenager who filmed the incident posted the video on TikTok before his connecting flight even took off. By the time Camryn landed in Phoenix 6 hours later on a rebooked flight, the video had 4 million views. By the next morning it was on every news network. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, local stations, international outlets. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a take. The video showed everything. Camryn asking politely. Natalie blocking her. The security team standing. The escalation. The diversion. Senator Lane's attempt to pay her off. And Camryn's refusal. That part went viral on its own. Clips of Camryn saying, I don't want your money. I want an explanation, got remixed into memes, into motivational posts, into evidence that Gen Z wasn't playing games anymore. Hashtag Justice for Camryn trended for 3 days. Hashtag Bathroom While Black became a rallying cry. People shared their own stories of being profiled, being stopped, being made to feel like they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. The conversation got loud. It got messy. It got necessary. Here's what I need you to understand. This story didn't go viral because it was unique. It went viral because it was familiar. Because millions of people saw themselves in Camryn. Because millions of people have been Natalied by someone with power and a badge and a fear they never dealt with. If you're one of those people, share this video right now. Let's make sure this story reaches everyone who needs to hear it. Let's make sure Camryn's courage doesn't get forgotten in the next news cycle. Senator Lane's office released a statement within 24 hours. It was carefully worded, focus grouped, and completely insufficient. It said, Senator Lane deeply regrets the incident that occurred on Flight 1847. She has directed her security team to undergo additional training and has personally reached out to Ms. Washington to offer her sincerest apologies. The senator remains committed to ensuring all individuals are treated with dignity and respect. The internet tore it apart. People pointed out that the statement didn't mention Natalie by name, didn't mention racial profiling, didn't mention accountability. It was an apology that apologized for nothing. 3 days later, Senator Lane held a press conference. She stood at a podium with the American flag behind her and said all the right words. She talked about learning and growing and listening. She talked about her commitment to civil rights. She talked about how much she valued the voices of young people like Camryn. She didn't talk about why her security team saw a black teenager as a threat. She didn't talk about the systems that made that possible. She didn't talk about the fact that she tried to write a check to make the problem go away. Camryn watched the press conference from her dorm room. She'd rescheduled the interview with Lucia. She'd gotten the footage. She'd started editing. And she'd decided something. She wasn't going to let Senator Lane control the narrative. She started her own TikTok account. She posted a video. Just her, sitting on her bed talking to the camera. She said, "My name is Camryn Washington. I'm 17 years old. A week ago, I asked to use a bathroom on a plane, and a senator's security team treated me like a terrorist. This is my story. Not the version you saw on the news. Not the version Senator Lane's PR team wants you to hear. Mine." The video got 10 million views in 2 days. She posted follow-ups. She talked about what it felt like to be blocked in that aisle. She talked about her grandmother. She talked about the passengers who stood up for her and the ones who looked away. She talked about Natalie's backstory because she believed people deserved the whole truth, even when it was complicated. She said, "Natalie Brennan lost someone she loved. That's real. That's tragic. But trauma doesn't give you permission to traumatize other people. Grief doesn't give you the right to make someone else afraid. And if you're using your pain as an excuse to hurt people who look like the person you lost, you're not honoring them. You're betraying them." That clip went viral too. Are you inspired by Camryn yet? Are you watching her turn her pain into power and wishing you had that kind of courage? You do. You absolutely do. Comment, "I have that courage," if you're ready to use your voice the way Camryn is using hers. Because the world needs you. The algorithm needs your engagement to push this message further. Don't just watch. Participate. Natalie Brennan resigned from Sentinel Security Group 5 days after the incident. The company released a statement saying her resignation was voluntary and that they were conducting an internal review of their protocols. Natalie didn't make a public statement. She just disappeared from the internet, from the news, from the conversation. But Camryn knew she was still out there. Still carrying Kira. Still trying to figure out how to live with what she'd done. Senator Lane's poll numbers dropped. Not by much. Not enough to cost her the next election. But enough to make her nervous. Enough to make her team scramble. Enough to make her announce a new initiative on implicit bias training for law enforcement and private security. It was something. It wasn't enough. But it was something. The airline issued Camryn a formal apology and a refund for her flight. They also offered her free flights for a year. She accepted the apology. She donated the flight vouchers to a nonprofit that helped low-income students travel for college visits. Marcus Webb called her once a week to check in. Ariel sent her a care package with snacks and a handwritten note that said, "You're going to change the world. I'm proud to have met you." The teenager who filmed the video, whose name was Jordan, started his own social justice account. He and Camryn became friends. They talked about starting a documentary series together. About finding stories like hers and making sure they got told. The grant committee saw Camryn's TikTok account. They saw the millions of views, the conversations she was starting, the way she was using media to create change. They didn't just give her the grant. They doubled it. $2,000. Enough for a camera and a laptop and a future that felt a little more possible. Camryn's mom flew to Phoenix and spent a weekend with her. They didn't talk much about the flight. They just sat together and ate her mom's cooking and watched old movies. Her mom said, "Your grandmother would be so proud." Camryn said, "I know." And for the first time since Dorothy died, she felt like maybe she was going to be okay. But the story wasn't over. Because stories like this never really end. They just keep going, keep rippling, keep forcing people to choose what kind of world they want to live in. If you're still watching, you're part of that ripple. You're part of the change. Subscribe to this channel right now if you haven't already. Because we're not just telling stories. We're building a movement. And every subscription, every like, every share, every comment is a vote for the kind of content that matters. Don't just scroll past. Be part of this. So what do we learn from this? What's the takeaway from a 17-year-old girl who asked to pee and ended up on the national news? Here's what I think. I think we learned that racism in 2025 doesn't always look like what we expect. It doesn't always scream slurs or burn crosses. Sometimes it wears a blazer and speaks in calm tones about security protocols. Sometimes it's a person who loved a black girl and lost her and let that love curdle into fear. Sometimes it's a system that trains people to see threats instead of humans. And I think we learned that power protects itself. Senator Lane didn't face real consequences. She gave a press conference. She launched an initiative. She moved on. Because that's what power does. It absorbs the blow, makes the right noises, and continues. But here's the other thing we learn. We learn that one person can make a difference. Camryn didn't have money. She didn't have connections. She didn't have a platform. All she had was the truth and the courage to tell it. And that was enough to start a conversation that reached millions. We learned that witnesses matter. Marcus could have stayed in his seat. Ariel could have stayed neutral. Jordan could have kept his phone in his pocket. But they didn't. They chose to see. They chose to speak. They chose to document. And because of them, Camryn wasn't alone. We learned that trauma is real, but it's not an excuse. Natalie's pain was real. Her grief was real. But she took that pain and turned it into a weapon. She let her fear become someone else's nightmare. And that's a choice. Trauma happens to us. What we do with it is up to us. Have you ever let your pain become someone else's problem? Have you ever caught yourself making assumptions about someone based on how they look? Be honest. Comment, I'm working on it, if you're trying to do better. Because we all have biases. We all have fears. The question is whether we're willing to examine them or whether we're going to let them run our lives. We learned that apologies without action are just words. Senator Lane apologized. But she didn't change the system that made Natalie possible. She didn't address the culture that trains security teams to see black bodies as threats. She didn't do the hard work. She did the easy work. And the easy work doesn't save lives. We learned that young people are done waiting for permission. Camryn didn't ask for anyone's approval to tell her story. She didn't wait for the news cycle to move on. She took control of the narrative. She used the tools she had, a phone, a camera, a voice, and she made people listen. That's the power of this generation. They're not asking for a seat at the table. They're building their own tables. We learned that the most dangerous thing you can do to power is refuse to be silent. Camryn could have taken the $10,000. She could have signed an NDA. She could have let Senator Lane's team bury the story under a pile of money and legal paperwork. But she didn't. She said no. She said, I want the truth more than I want your comfort. And that's what scared them. We learned that change is slow and frustrating and necessary. This one incident didn't end racism. It didn't reform security protocols. It didn't make the world safe for every black teenager who just needs to use the bathroom. But it moved the needle. It started conversations. It made people uncomfortable. And discomfort is where change begins. Here's the question I want to leave you with. What are you going to do with this story? Are you going to watch it, feel something for 10 minutes and then scroll to the next video? Or are you going to let it change you? Are you going to let it make you braver? Are you going to let it make you a better witness? Because that's the real lesson. Not that one girl stood up, but that we all can. Every single day. In every space where someone is being made to feel small. In every moment when power is being used to crush dignity. In every situation where we have the choice to speak or stay silent. What are you going to choose? If this story changed something in you, prove it. Subscribe, like, share, comment. Tell me what you're going to do differently. Tell me how you're going to show up. Tell me you're ready to be part of the solution instead of part of the silence. Because Camryn walked anyway. And now it's your turn. Let me ask you one more time. If you were on that plane, what would you have done? Would you have been Marcus, pulling out your credentials and demanding accountability? Would you have been Ariel, standing between a teenager and the people trying to intimidate her? Would you have been Jordan, hands shaking but phone recording, documenting the truth even when it was scary? Would you have been one of the passengers who said, I'm a witness? Or would you have been one of the people who looked down? Who pretended not to see? Who told themselves it wasn't their problem? I'm not asking to judge you. I'm asking because that's the question this story forces us to answer. Not what we'd like to think we'd do. What we'd actually do when the moment comes and the cost is real. Camryn didn't ask to be a hero. She asked to pee. That's it. The most basic human need. And she was turned into a threat, a problem, a national incident, because someone looked at her skin and her hoodie and decided she didn't belong. But here's what she did with that moment. She didn't shrink. She didn't apologize for existing. She didn't take the money. She didn't sign the NDA. She didn't let them rewrite her story. She told the truth. The whole truth. The complicated, uncomfortable, necessary truth. And that truth reached millions. It started conversations in living rooms and classrooms and boardrooms. It made people question their assumptions. It made people examine their fears. It made people choose whether they were going to be witnesses or bystanders. That's the power you have. Every single one of you watching this. You have the power to be a witness. You have the power to document what's happening. You have the power to say, this isn't right. You have the power to refuse the easy apology and demand the real one. You have the power to share stories like this and make sure they don't get buried. You have the power to walk anyway. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you think about the times you stayed silent or the times you spoke up, do something with that feeling. Subscribe to this channel right now. Not tomorrow. Not later. Right now. Because we're not just telling stories here. We're building a community of people who refuse to look away. We're creating a space where truth matters more than comfort. Where accountability matters more than convenience. And if you don't subscribe, you're choosing to stay comfortable. You're choosing to let stories like Camryn's disappear into the algorithm. You're choosing silence. Don't be that person. Hit that like button if you believe Camryn deserved better. If you believe every person deserves to move through the world without being treated like a threat. If you believe that bathrooms on planes should be available to everyone regardless of what they look like. Share this video. Send it to your family group chat. Send it to your friends who say racism isn't real anymore. Send it to your coworkers who think just comply, is reasonable advice. Send it to anyone who needs to understand that the most dangerous kind of racism isn't the kind that screams. It's the kind that smiles and speaks softly and calls the pilot and turns a bathroom request into a federal incident. Drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've ever experienced something like this. Tell me what you would have done on that plane. Tell me if you made it this far, because if you did, you're not just a viewer. You're part of this movement. Comment, "I walked anyway," if this story changed something in you. If it made you see racism differently. If it made you understand that good people can do terrible things when they let fear run their lives. If it made you want to be braver, kinder, more willing to stand up. Camryn is 19 now. She's in college studying film and journalism. Her documentary about the flight won 3 awards. It's streaming on multiple platforms. It's being shown in classrooms across the country. It's starting conversations that need to be had. She still flies. She still uses the bathroom when she needs to. And she still carries her grandmother's voice with her everywhere she goes. Dorothy used to say, "Freedom costs something. And we pay it forward." Camryn paid it forward. She turned her pain into purpose. She turned her humiliation into education. She turned a moment that could have broken her into a story that's changing people. Now it's your turn. What are you going to do with this? Are you going to scroll past and forget about it in an hour? Or are you going to let it sit with you? Are you going to let it make you uncomfortable? Are you going to let it change the way you see the world? Because that's what stories like this are for. Not to make you feel good. Not to give you easy answers. But to make you think. To make you question. To make you choose. The next time you see someone being treated like they don't belong, what are you going to do? The next time you see power being used to make someone small, what are you going to do? The next time you have the choice between looking away and being a witness, what are you going to do? I hope you choose to walk anyway. Subscribe, like, share, comment. Be part of the community that refuses to stay silent. Be part of the movement that believes every person deserves dignity, even in an airplane aisle 30,000 feet above Texas. This is Black Power Stories. This is where we tell the truth, the whole truth, the complicated, uncomfortable, necessary truth. And we're just getting started. If you made it this far, drop a comment right now. Tell me you're here. Tell me you're listening. Tell me you're ready to walk anyway. Let's change the world. One story at a time.